Good afternoon, everyone. Actually, can I suggest that those sitting in the back come up a little bit in front? That's okay. So, because this rows are looking a little rather sparse. That's all. That's okay. Yes. So, good afternoon, everyone, and a very warm welcome to UNU-WIDER. I'm Kunal Sen, the director of UNU-WIDER, and it's a great pleasure to chair today's discussion, which is going to be on what do we know about poverty and inequality, the next development agenda. Thank you for all for joining us, both here and we have a large online audience. What promises to be a very engaging and thought-provoking conversation. It is now 10 years since world leaders around the world embraced the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, which was seen as a transformative agenda. And this year's Sustainable Development Goals report, which is the kind of annual stock taking the UN does every year, finds that only 35% of SDG targets are on track or making moderate progress. Nearly half are moving too slowly, and alarmingly, 18%, 18%, are in reverse. In the words of the UN Secretary General, we are and we face a global development emergency. So even today, we're going to focus on two key SDGs. SDG 1, zero poverty, and SDG 10, reduce inequalities. So we're going to try and ask the question, what do we know about progress on SDG 1 and SDG 10? These two core SDGs, which many would argue are among the most important SDGs. All 17 are important, but these are particularly important, especially for those interested in questions around hunger, poverty, and inequality. So how reliable is our knowledge of true poverty and inequality? How should we think about the agenda on poverty and inequality, not just for the next 5 years to 2030, but going beyond 2030? And that's important discussion, that important part of the discussion today. So what we're going to try and do in this next couple of hours is focus on the latest evidence that we have, debate different measurement approaches and target indicators, explore the profound implications of the analysis on measurement and indicators for where we are today, and also looking beyond 2030. So it's both about the next 5 years till 2030, but also going beyond 2030. So before we begin, and we will have two presentations to start with and then a panel discussion, a few quick housekeeping notes. We're delighted to have a large audience online, as I said, also here. And we are, it's wonderful to see this interest in this topic, but just to be aware that this particular room is fully microphoned so that online participants can hear everything that you can say, speak here. It's great, but that also means that that you need to be careful that even quiet side conversations or whispers can be picked up. And so you need to be aware that it might happen. So I would kindly ask you to please keep your voices low or not speak at all, ideally during the presentation. And of course, in the Q&A, you're most welcome to ask questions and we can have a conversation. Also to know that today's event will be recorded and the recording will be posted on the UNU-WIDER YouTube channel by the end of next week. So in other words, if you missed something in the debate here, you can come back and listen to it in a week and a half time. So for those joining us online, welcome and thank you for being with us. And you can send your questions to us using the Q&A tool at the bottom of your screen. Our colleague here is going to collect those questions at the Q&A session, and then you will hear the questions in that session, in the discussion itself. And for those of you here in the room, you have to, and please hold out your questions till the Q&A session. So even clarificatory questions are like that to be there in the Q&A discussion. And also you find the Wi-Fi details, tape the tables in front of you if you need Wi-Fi. Restrooms are just located just on the hall that way. So let's begin. And first we can do now, and let me walk you through the program a little bit. The first two presentations, and I'll introduce the presenters in a minute. And then we're going to have a panel discussion. And in between, we'll just reconvene. We could reorganize the room a little bit for the panel discussion. And I'll introduce the panelists also in a minute. So let me introduce the presenters first. The first presenter is Dr. Khalid Abu-Ismail, United Nations Economic and Social Commission of Western Asia, UN-ESCWA, and based in Beirut. And he'll present findings of a new UN-ESCWA report, which is pretty much launched today, and the report is titled World Poverty Through a Broader Lens, Rethinking Measurement and Policy Approaches. He'll present for 20 minutes. And then Rahul Lahoti, sitting right there in front of us, research associate at UNU-WIDER and lead of the World Income Inequality Database, WIID in short, which is our own database in UNU-WIDER. He'll introduce the WIID companion series, which provides the most comprehensive set of harmonized global income inequality statistics available today. So it's our first presentation on poverty, largely, but also inequality from Khalid, and then on inequality by Rahul. Then, as I said, take a short 5-minute break, reconvene, reorganize the room, and then we're going to have a panel discussion taking forward the presentations that you heard earlier today. We will hear later today. So the panelists are Khalid, of course, and Rahul too, back again as a panelist. And we also have two online panelists, Chico Ferreira, Amartya Professor of Inequality Studies at the London School of Economics. I think Chico's already online. And Dean Joliffe, Research Manager for Poverty, Inequality, and Human Development, the World Bank, also joining us online. And very glad to have Franziska Disslbacher, who is a professor at the Research Institute Economics and Inequality at Vienna University of Economics and Business. And Franziska is here in person for us to listen to afterwards. So first presentations, two presentations, 5-minute break, and then we reconvene for the panel, and then we could have a very interesting panel discussion afterwards. Khalid, over to you.
Thank you, Amar. Well, good afternoon, everybody. Pleasure to be back in Helsinki at UN-WIDER. And I have the daunting task of presenting world poverty in, 20 minutes or so? So I'll get straight to it. The first question we get asked is, why is a regional commission like ESCWA doing global reports on human development and poverty? The answer is simple. If you wanted to tell a regional story on human development or money-metric or multidimensional poverty, and you were referring to the global metrics, whether it's the 215 for money-metric poverty or the HEI, you wouldn't be able to do justice at the regional level to the nuances. So take, for example, the issue we're facing when telling a story at the regional level. There are three major challenges that any poverty story has to address when you're looking at income poverty across countries. And the fact that if you use national poverty lines, the way the country define poverty, they're not comparable because each country has its own definitions. So you can't use that. At the same time, if you use the 215 PPP-based poverty line, it's relevant for one group of countries, not for all. And if you use a relative line, such as used in many of the high-income countries, then I'm not even sure that we're measuring poverty. And for a region as highly diversified as the Arab region, that, as you'll see, has some of the richest and poorest countries worldwide, these nuances become all the more relevant. So our end goal is to produce a regional narrative. That's our function, that's our goal. And we're about to publish a regional report based on the methodology and approach that I am about to present. But I also want to allude to another function that we have as a regional commission, which is to actually contribute to a global debate as important as poverty, and to offer an alternative perspective from the South, from our region. So this is also part of what we do. So on our approach and methodology, there are really two suggestions that we have. One is that we propose these so-called ESCWA poverty lines or concave poverty lines. And these are poverty lines that have three basic characteristics. One is that for all countries, for any country, a minimum floor of 215 a day is used. And this is where we, any country per day, per capita, 215 is a good floor to measure called extreme poverty. So it will not be lower than that. And that's what we call the absolute minimum. So this is the absolute part of our approach. But once countries start graduating from low income to middle income, the poverty lines become relative. So they increase with the level of income. And that's very important because you also want to reflect the rising costs of living that you expect to have in different country situations, especially middle income and upper middle income. But where we, I think, are different from other approaches is that we don't use a fixed linear relative line. We're not using, for example, half of the median. No, it's a nonlinear relationship. So basically, the rise in the poverty line, the poverty line rises with income, but it rises at a lower rate. Okay. And this is what gives the concavity feature that you can see in the relationship between our estimated poverty lines and mean income. Now, this concavity assumption is very important. And that's why perhaps it's important to just explain it. There's a couple of important papers that we have that you can refer to go through the methodological details. One of them is the paper that we have on titled Counting the World's Poor, back to Engel's Law. And essentially, it is back to Engel's Law. And as you may recall, Engel's Law was observing that the food share would tend to, of consumption expenditure, would tend to decline with rising income. Now, we're basically arguing that you can extend this to not just food, but other baskets of essential food expenditure. And we show this from LIS data for different bundles of basic expenditures. And we also have another paper, which is the other technical paper that we have with the title of Demarcation of ESCWA Poverty Lines, where we show that this specific formulation, a log-log regression that we use in order to estimate the ESCWA poverty line, log of national poverty lines to log of income, is the best fit out there to explain this relationship. So basically, the first innovation, before I get into the second, is that we want to anchor the debate, take it back to the way in which countries define the cost of basic needs, the national poverty lines. But because the national poverty lines are defined in very different ways, we rely on the relationship between national poverty lines and income. And we assume that that relationship is statistically robust and that it has a concave relationship. So this is our first contribution. The second contribution, which is equally important, is that we don't deal with poverty or with the poor as one group. We introduce three different groups of the poor. First, there's destitution and poverty, which is the group that earns below $1.50 a day. And then there's a second group that earns above $1 a day, $1.50 a day, but below 2/3 of this ESCWA poverty line. And then there's a residual moderate poverty group, which is basically earning above the extreme poverty line or below the threshold for the ESCWA poverty. And there's another group, which we thought would be important to highlight, the group that lies just above the ESCWA poverty line, the vulnerable group. Now, I know that there are different definitions of vulnerability, but the definition we have here is that if you're earning 1.5 times the poverty, the ESCWA poverty line, then, or below, but above the moderate line, then you belong to this group. And again, there's a whole lot of technical work that has been done to justify each one of those, which you can freely refer to. So to summarize, there are two propositions. One, use poverty lines that are anchored in the relationship between the way that countries define poverty, national poverty lines, and national income, in a way that reflects this relationship in a more meaningful manner than just assume it's fixed. And the second is, don't treat the poor as one group. There are various forms of poverty, and I think any perspective should be broad enough to take that into account. So now to the report findings. And there are three main questions. The first question is, what are the implications on the global poverty narrative once we start applying these new definitions? Does it change the narrative? And we're also taking a very long period, so from 95 to 2024. So we're interested to go even before the SDGs benchmark of 215. And the second question is, what is the outlook? Are we on track, as Kunal said, to achieve a significant reduction in poverty compared to the 2015 baseline? And if not, as we will see, then what to do? The key findings. Well, the first thing is, regardless of any poverty line you use, world poverty, if we treat the world as one country, world poverty has declined. Okay, so it doesn't matter if you're using $2 a day or if you're using $9 a day, but the degree of poverty reduction will depend on your choice of poverty line, as you can see in the gap between both lines. Second, I'm not going to focus on the details of the graphs. We can discuss those later, but just to get the gist of what is entailed. We still have 1 in 3 people, 27%, to be precise, 27.5, who are poor by our definition using ESCWA poverty lines. And half of the world population in 2024 is either poor or vulnerable to poverty. But notice, as you can see here, that after 2010 and after 2015, there's been very limited progress in poverty reduction worldwide. So this is the kind of picture that we want to show, not just on poverty, but on the groups of the poor, the destitution poverty, the extreme poverty, the moderate poverty, and the vulnerability. Okay? And you can see that story has a very strong regional dimension to it. And this is what justifies our work. Because the only region worldwide where you can see poverty rising is the Arab region. I know conventional wisdom is that the Arab region is a rich region. And well, that's true. But it's also a region where you have a lot of differences between countries. And it's the only region worldwide where poverty has been rising since 2010. As expected, East Asia is driving world poverty reduction, followed closely by South Asia. And Sub-Saharan Africa, as you can see, is also stagnating after 2010. And if you look at the same picture, but by income level, you'll see it clearly. Low-income countries are bearing the brunt of poverty. And it's very clear that this is a region where all forms of poverty are rising. Okay. So it is still very much a problem of lack of progress and high levels of poverty. Not just the level, but there's a lack of progress in low-income countries. The fifth main conclusion is that let's zoom in, as we should, speaking about the post-2030 agenda, on the poorest of the poor. Sure, there's been progress. The number of people living below $1.50 has reduced from 600 million in 95 to 300. But there's still, mainly in Sub-Saharan Africa, and there's been a significant rise in the Arab region from 8 million to 42 million. That's not surprising because three of the fastest rises in poverty worldwide were in the Arab region, in conflict-affected Yemen, Syria, and Somalia. And of course, China is on the opposite side of the spectrum, with one of the top three poverty reductions worldwide. So what has been driving these results? And as I said, there is no doubt, that poverty has declined. Not so much if you start with the 215 as your baseline, but as I said, our perspective has been more longer term. And if that's your baseline, 1995, there's no doubt that there has been a decline in poverty. And there's also no doubt that the growth in household income has been the strongest driver of this reduction. You can see that the fastest reductions in poverty were also accompanied by very high rises in income and vice versa. So very strong relation, and it cuts across income groups, and you can see it very clearly. You can also see, and I know this is a controversial slide, that if you rely on the Ginies from the household surveys and you compare the baseline of 95 to the current, vast majority of countries have reduced their income inequality if we use that measure. Now, we can maybe talk a little more about the different narratives to this one. So these are our key findings that I wanted to highlight. Now let's move to the second question, the outlook. Are we on track to reduce poverty using this ESCWA definition by half by 2030? And the answer is no, we're not. If we use everything that we know to do the forecasting, everything that we know about income projections, we take it from the DESA or from the IMF, it doesn't matter. We do our own projections of the Ginies, which is another paper, technical paper, if you're interested in, and we apply them, projecting world poverty using the ESCWA poverty lines. You'll see that there is still a gap of close to 10% between where we're supposed to be and where we are in 2030. Okay, so we are going to reduce poverty to 24.7, but we're supposed to be at 15.9 to get to that target. As you can expect, the regions that are lagging far behind are Sub-Saharan Africa and the Arab region, and of course, by income group, low-income countries. So for the purposes of policies and setting policies, it's important to distinguish between four groups of countries. And the first group are the countries that have already achieved this target or, basically very, very close to achieving it. The second group of countries are countries that are quite close, and with a very slight nudge, as I would say, they can easily achieve it. The third group of countries, however, need a big push. And the fourth group of countries, they are far from any realistic prospect to achieving these goals. So I think this helps contextualize the policy recommendations that the report has to offer, because it will direct its policy recommendations to these types of groups. But notice something very important here, that the difference between groups 2 and group 3 is not in their 2015 baseline. It's actually in their ability to reduce poverty. Group 2 are reducing it much faster than group 3. And I'll get back to the reasons why. So what do we need to do? Well, obviously for group 3 and group 4, the growth rates in household income need to be a lot faster. But that means that the growth needs to actually reach households first. And this is a key theme in a lot of our work and in the report itself. Much of the discussion around economic growth is actually centered on national accounts, GNIs, but that doesn't matter for a pro-poor or even pro-household perspective. You need to have growth going down to households. And the difference between the growth rates at the national level and the household level is what we call the pass-through. And that pass-through is very weak for the Arab countries and Sub-Saharan Africa. That basically means you have to work twice as hard with this kind of relationship at the national level to get the same impact at the household level in those regions compared to East Asia, for example. So to find a way to get this trickle down faster. But there's no doubt, this is the second thing we recommend, that you also need to work on income distribution. This is where Group 2 can also do a lot of work. All groups need to increase their pro-poor fiscal policies. And we actually go into a lot of details to suggest how this can be possible. But the first starting point, and we've argued this repeatedly, is to have an open budget, is to have more transparency, is to have, in some cases even, mandatory reporting of income and wealth. So if you don't have an evidence-based approach to setting fiscal policies, you're not going to be able to build the political economy consensus that will lead to whatever choices on fiscal policy that you're going to adopt. Now, the good news is that we show that even with the limitations of household income surveys, not including the top incomes, that there is still sufficient fiscal space, that the cost of poverty reduction is manageable for groups 2 and 3 as a share of top income, top 10%, top decile income, or even more so as a share of top decile wealth. Okay, so there are resources out there that you can resort to. But especially in the case of Group 4, you need to address non-monetary, non-macroeconomic, non-fiscal policy issues. You need to get to the heart of the poverty issues. And that takes us, this is another key theme of the report, to the multidimensional approach. And we have done a lot of work with our colleagues in OFI in Oxford and other partners on multidimensional poverty. And we firmly believe that it is in the investments in human development, in capabilities, a la Amartya Sen, in governance frameworks, that you will be able to address the root of money-metric poverty. And we can see a very vivid example here. Remember, I said that Groups 2 and Group 3 had the same initial levels, but one was able to reduce poverty faster than the other, Group 2. Well, look at the differences between them in governance, in health, and in education, initial conditions. That explains a lot of it. But for Group 4, you can't throw money on solving these problems. When you get to a situation where you have in Palestine or in other countries in the Arab region, the multidimensional approach is the only way that you can start thinking about this. No amount of money is going to alleviate suffering in a place like Gaza. You need to think beyond that. And so that's something we have to be cognizant of, that it's very important to adopt this multidimensional poverty approach, especially in conflict-affected settings. And this graph, which is a correlation, simple correlation between the global MPI and our extreme threshold, shows the reason why. If we had a perfect correlation, then we don't need the MPI, right? We don't. And there's a good reason why, because they're measuring different things. Some countries have much higher MPIs than their extreme money-metric poverty and vice versa. And that's what we expect. They complement each other. Both perspectives complement each other. So to summarize, we are basically proposing four things, and 2 things on the analytical issues. One is that we do need these new metrics, a broader perspective and a new way to think about poverty lines. And when we adopt this, we see that the narrative does change. In some ways, it's still the same as the conventional wisdom. There has been progress if you take a long-term perspective. But the order of magnitude of the poverty challenge is perhaps much larger than we think. And more importantly, destitution, which I haven't seen been the focus of a lot of work globally, is still very much a reality. So going forward, that also needs to be part of our conversation. Number three, progress is limited and we're not getting to our targets. So something has to change. And finally, growth and redistribution are important, especially for groups 2 and 3, but you need to address the root causes of poverty, especially for group 4 countries. Finally, I'd like to make a few acknowledgements. This has been work years in the making, and we couldn't have done it without the World Bank. So I have to say that we're thankful for them for the work. I know Dean is here to talk to us about the PIP, which is essentially what we use to make this work across 170 countries. But we also added to it from our own region where we had more detailed information. And also we build on the work of many World Bank experts, particularly the late Martin Ravalli. As I said, this has been work years in the making. We're grateful to a large number of experts globally and regionally, particularly the late Ali Abdel Adir, Fahmi Abdel Khalid, Sabina Al-Kir, Heba Laythi, James Foster, who, by the way, had proposed a concave poverty line in one of his papers. So this idea of concave poverty lines is not new. It dates back to a paper that he also did back in the 98, I think, if I'm not mistaken. Sanjay Reddy, Paul Makdisi, and many others. And last but by no means least, I'd like to thank our departing executive secretary, Rola Deshti, for her strong support. I believe we're probably the only UN agency that's actually doing this kind of work. So I think we owe her a thank you for that. And thank you very much.
So thanks for that. After the in-depth deep dive into poverty and how it looks, we'll look at inequality in a different way in terms of trying to understand what do we know about inequality and how do we track inequality through various measures. So I'll briefly talk about the SDGs and the SDG snapshot. What do we know about inequality as of today? Broadly, using three inequality data sets: the WIID data set, which Kunal referred to earlier, WIDER, the PIP database, which is Poverty and Inequality Platform from the bank, and the Paris School World Inequality Database. Will try to see whether the conclusions on inequality differ if you use different data sets. Does it matter in terms of policy and tracking? And what is the way forward out of measurement crisis? And also, what can we do? So just as a reminder, SDG 10 is about reducing inequality within and among countries. Broadly, the goal is that the growth of the bottom 40% should be higher than the growth of the national average. And SDG and the World Bank have been tracking this. According to them, around 108 countries for which there is data from the last 5 years. There is progress on it, which means that on the other half, we are still not there. There are significant regional differences. But this measure is data dependent because it's looking at growth and it needs 2 data points in a 5-year period. So I tried to do something slightly different where we look at bottom shares for the bottom 40%, long-term evolution of them, And if the bottom shares for the bottom 40% are increasing, then they are growing at a higher rate than the national average. So there are two graphs here. One is for the WIID companion, which is looking at the net income per capita. This is using only surveys. Here you find that the bottom line, which is the world share, green line, it indicates that the bottom 40 shares have increased for the world as a whole. You'll find several regions have seen that increase, but some regions like South Asia, MENA, have seen a decline in these shares. So even the bottom 40 shares have declined in these regions. And East Asia and Europe have seen a significant increase in the bottom 40 shares. This picture changes slightly when you look at a WIID, which incorporates the top end and taxes. Here you'll find that for many regions, the trend remains the same, but you'll find that there are particular regions, specifically if you look at this black line for Latin America, it seems to, after 2015, by incorporating the top shares, it seems to be that the bottom 40 have declined. And also the declines in bottom 40 share for South Asia are larger, and even for the MENA region. So this is just an illustration to show, as throughout the presentation, that the metric you use and the measures you use matter. Now moving from the bottom 40, which is looking at part of the distribution, to a broader measure of Gini, which looks at the entire distribution. This is from WIID for income inequality. You'll find that for 2022, that Southern Africa in particular, but most African countries have among the highest inequality. And here we are trying to measure the same concept of income net income per capita inequality across regions. So around South Africa is among the highest, around 0.6667. And then the second set of countries would, large countries would include India, Brazil, Turkey, which are around 50 Gini points. And then China, Mexico, and the US are similarly unequal, around 40 Gini points. This picture, if you look at from the top 10 shares, these countries remain the same, but there are additions of countries like Russia, Iran, Saudi Arabia, which get added as highly unequal countries. The other thing is, if you look at Gini for regional interpersonal inequality, what I mean here is that if you consider the region as one unit and see within that region what has happened. So here you will see the evolution of China, because if you look at in 1990, Asia had among the highest inequality as a region, but that has declined over time because of growth in China. So the Chinese are now closer to Japanese and South Korean. So that has declined. But in other regions like South Asia, interpersonal inequality has increased. Even for the MENA region, the interpersonal inequality rankings have increased. Sub-Saharan Africa in general has higher inequality, which has stayed throughout the period. Now we look at global inequality. Global inequality is where I'm considering the globe as one unit and trying to look at interpersonal inequality. So it incorporates both the between country component and the within country component. So the between country component, which is the Gini line on the, is decreased from 70 to around 60. But you will find that after 2015, it's sort of stagnated. This is a large decline, but most of this decline is between country inequality. Because if you look at the lower lines, in particular the red line, you will find that this is average Gini of countries over time. This is just taking one country as unit and doing the averages. Their inequality has declined, as we saw in the poverty presentation also. It declined from 45 to around 43, but not as substantive. But here there's an interesting phenomenon that the more if you population weighted, you'll find the inequality has slightly increased because the more populous countries, especially India, China, have seen an increase in inequality. This picture looks a little less optimistic when you look at the top shares, because top shares from WID, the top 1% has sort of stayed almost the same with slight increases over this long time frame. And for the top 10%, there was a certain increase, but it's back to where it was. So there's not substantive decline since the 1990s in these two, which the Gini sort of shows. So now let's look at the global inequality datasets and why they differ, why there's so many differences. First, I'll talk a little bit more in detail about the WIID. So WIID is this database which has been hosted by UNU-WIDER since 2000. And in the last few years, around 4 or 5 years back, we added the WIID companion. So WIID is a repository where all the universe of data surveys come in, and we have quality markers for them. The WIID companion is where we do these stages where we select particular data sets. Sort of each country year has one selected survey, which is based on coverage, quality, as well as a longest consistent series. Then after the selection, we try to standardize the surveys. This is an important step because we want to compare apples to apples, because countries sometimes have consumption surveys and others have income surveys. So we try to bring them to a same concept of net income per capita. And this is done using the country itself as an anchor, or its region and income groupings as an average, as an anchor to convert between the two concepts. After this, we get a Lorenz curve, which helps us sort of create any inequality measure we want. And so you'll find that WIID has the whole range of inequality measures, and it has a broad coverage because it's based only on surveys. There's no tax data requirement here. The WIID Explorer, which was added last year, basically provides a good platform for visualization. There are shortcomings in terms that because it is only survey only, it misses out the top and which we don't do any explicit top tail reconstruction, and there is some model dependence in the conversions. So how does this compare to PIP and WID, which is the World Inequality Database? We are close to PIP in terms of both are survey only, but PIP does not do any harmonization, so it has a mix of income and consumption surveys. You'll find in consumption surveys are mostly in Asia and Africa, whereas Latin America and developed countries have income surveys, so they get mixed up. In WID is substantively different in terms of it combines surveys with tax and admin data plus national accounts to create a top tail reconstruction. So it captures the rich better. But in developing countries, this tax data or administrative data is weak, and so it has to make certain assumptions for that. So there are some question marks on how the quality of data for the developing country varies. Now that we have looked at the differences, do inequality levels differ? We have some clues that they do. Here, what we are doing is trying to look at a select set of countries. These all countries are arbitrary, just large countries across various regions. You'll find, let's focus on, say, the Gini as a measure. You'll find here that, say, the world Gini is quite close between the squares are WID, WIID, and the triangles is the WID. So they're quite close, but you'll find that in certain countries, like, say, India, there's a big difference between PIP, which is measuring consumption inequality, WIID, which is measuring income inequality, and WID, which is measuring a sort of top-end corrected inequality. And typically, the rule is that WID, the top-end corrected, is the highest in general, and and PIP is the lowest. The WIID comes closer to the PIP when their welfare concepts match, or in certain regions, income and consumption do not have as many differences. But otherwise, WID is somewhere in the middle of this. So you'll find that China, India, even Indonesia, but the difference between, or Egypt, the difference between the PIP measure and the WIID measure differs by region because, as we said, it's anchored by the country or the region. The top 10 shares also shows a similar pattern. Top 10 shows a more starker pattern, partly because WIID is adjusted for the top. Surprisingly, the trends do not differ as much. There are some trend differences, but broadly they are similar. Like you'll find that in India, there is some trend differences and Nigeria has a sharper peak, but overall the trends are quite similar. So why do disagreements exist? So generally, whenever consumption is used, which PIP uses when the underlying survey concept is consumption, it lowers inequality as compared to income surveys. Top tail reconstruction increases inequality in general. And there are inequality measures. Gini and top shares can tell you different stories, and they both can be true. It might be the case that the Ginis are declining and the top shares are static or increasing, and both can be true even with the same data. So the measures also matter, as well as the data sets, how they construct the concepts matter. Now, does it matter in terms of tracking and policy? I'll give you just 2 examples. One is the World Bank last year, 2023, launched a new inequality indicator. The indicator is simple. It just says that a country is defined as high inequality if its PIP Gini exceeds 40. And it is simple to understand, it's clear, but it's concept dependent. By that, I mean that it's dependent on the underlying survey, whether it's consumption income, and there's no top tail reconstruction. So what happens is, Carlos and I have written about this in terms of there are several countries which have mismatches. 2 of the biggest countries are India, where this PIP says it's not a high inequality country, whereas WIID and WIID have an inequality measure of 50. So according to that definition, it should be a high inequality country. So how do we classify the country? Depends should not depend on the underlying measure. There should be more clarity on it. And similarly for China, Egypt, and Nigeria, they might be defined differently based on what data sets you're using. The India example is a little stark because India has a big gap between its consumption inequality, which is measured by its national NSS surveys, and income inequality, which has been measured by IHDS, Indian Human Development Survey. So recently, the World Bank released saying that India's Gini index is 25.5, which was touted by the government of India as it is the fourth most equal country in the world, which is in sharp contrast to, say, a recent paper by the Paris School, which says that income inequality in India is greater than that from the British colonial Raj, and the top shares are around 22.6%. And if you also compare from WIID, you'll find that income inequality in India is higher than the world average, as well as higher than Brazil or China. So these 2 contrasting narratives create a problem because the government is claiming that our policies have worked, whereas the data might be contrasting. So, and the ground reality would tell something different. So we need to get our sort of answers clear. In short, we know far more about inequality because there's better data, there are better methods, there's harmonization as well as top-end corrections, which has helped us know better. But inequality levels and cross-country comparisons are still flawed in terms of which data set you use and what measures you use. And it's important to understand that each of these 3 data sets, and there are other data sets, regional as well as broader data sets, which I have not covered here, but each data set has its own purpose. PIP is very important for if you're doing poverty and inequality analysis, because most of the other, even WIID or WIID, do not do any poverty analysis. So it's important for that. We would say WIID is interesting for cross-country comparisons where we have broader coverage, and WIID for the top income concentrations. And the communication of the concepts should be very clear. because otherwise the governments as well as public, the Indian government is comparing consumption inequality with US of 41 income inequality, where it looks very equal. So that becomes a problem. And the other recommendation is for tracking is that we move away from a single measure, like the bottom 40 shares for SDGs, to include different aspects, because each measure is capturing different parts of the distribution and can be sensitive to different things. And in the whole debate, wealth inequality hasn't come into the picture, which I think we'll talk about more later. And there is a need for more data. This is partly because if you look at countries now, we have gone from a period where data was abundant to less abundant. So South Africa hasn't had surveys since 2017. India hadn't had surveys for around 10 years in the middle. And a lot of smaller countries haven't had surveys in the past 5 or 6 years. Surveys important, and tax and administrative is important for top shares. So that is about it, and we look forward to questions from the panel after a 5-minute break. Thank you.
Right, let's begin the panel discussion. And I just want to again introduce the panelists. We have two online, Chico Ferreira, who is Amartya Sen Professor in Inequality Studies at LSE, and Dean Joliffe, Research Manager for Poverty, Equality, and Human Development at the World Bank. And he leads the work on the Poverty Inequality Platform, which you already heard about in the presentations. And also Franziska Disslbacher, who's Professor at the Research Institute of Economics of Inequality, the Vienna Institute of Economics and Business. And then, of course, our two presenters here in the panel, Khalid on the right and Rahul on the left. I think what's interesting from the presentations that we already heard, which are very rich presentations, we already had a sense now of three things, and maybe there are more things we can discuss in the panel. First, we can see that trying to broaden the lens on poverty and inequality allows us to see different things, perhaps also see things which you wouldn't have seen with a narrower conceptualization of poverty, in particular, perhaps less so inequality. So first is exactly broadening the lens. How useful is that and why it's important? Second, we already see are the differences we see, especially in the inequality measures, or how different measures we're getting depending on which concept, which measures we use. And what that means in terms of the tracking of progress on SDG 1 and SDG 10, and then going beyond 2030. And the third thing, particularly for Khalid's presentation, is about policies and how to think about different groups of people who are poor, whether they're vulnerable or they're extreme poverty or destitute, and taking through exactly policy packages that might be different in different countries and different contexts. So I think we're already getting a sense from the presentations how complex the discussions are on measurement, but also policies. So I'm going to start with now that I have these three panelists to join us, along with Rahul and Khalid, to bring their perspectives in. I'm going to start with Chico Ferreira, who's online. And I'm going to ask Chico the following question. Chico, you have been working for a long time with your experience in the World Bank, and previously and now your current work on inequality at LSE. What are your initial reflections on the UN-ESCWA report to move beyond, it's called to move beyond conventional metrics of poverty? Can you also take us through the link between poverty and inequality, because these are seen as two different SDGs? Is it appropriate actually for development agendas and goals to treat these as separate issues? The poverty is a different goal versus inequality. So over to you, Chico. We have 5 minutes for each of you to speak at the initial interventions, and then we have more time for discussion afterwards. Chico, over to you.
Thanks very much, Kunal. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, absolutely.
Great. So good afternoon to colleagues in Helsinki and online. I'm sorry I can't be with you in Helsinki today, but I'm grateful for the opportunity to participate online. So there are two parts to Kunal's question to me. The first is on the ESCWA report, the other one on the link between poverty and inequality more generally. So on the UN-ESCWA report, let me just first say that I really welcome this report. I think there's a lot to like in it. I think the sort of 4-part country taxonomy based on how close or far countries are from their ability to meet the poverty reduction goal by 2030 is a helpful taxonomy. I think the emphasis of the report on transparency in income reporting in the Arab region is very welcome. I think the emphasis on trying to better understand the gaps between macro and micro assessments of growth, so the measures of growth in the national accounts vis-a-vis what, to use their language, what passes through to households. I think that's a first order question, and as we saw, it really matters in much of the developing world and certainly in the Arab region. So there's a lot to like. Now, your question, I think, Kunal, refers particularly to the innovation in metrics. And there, let me make 2 points. First, on the concave poverty lines. So that concave poverty line that Khalid took us through is an example of what we call a weakly relative poverty line, right? Which is one that has first a fixed poverty line at very low levels of income, and then allows the poverty line to rise with income afterwards, albeit weakly. And so it sort of lies in between absolute poverty, strictly speaking, and strong relative poverty lines. And Khalid introduced that a little bit. So there's two sort of basic components to that, just to remind ourselves. The first is this view that poverty, even if it is absolute in the space of capabilities, to use San's word, is not going to be absolute in the space of commodities, because to reach the same capabilities, the same functionings in different societies, you may need more commodities as you move to a richer society. That's why the poverty line would rise. The key innovation that goes back to a paper by Atkinson and Bourguignon, and then another one by Ravalion and Chen, and then finally one by Dean, Joliffe was here, and Espen Prids, was to use the national poverty lines to provide an empirical basis for that slope, for how the weekly line would rise, right? So to use countries' own decisions about what, particularly absolute, they have relative lines there too, but particularly the absolute lines being very different in, say, Chile relative to Malawi, was what provides the identification, so to speak, of that line. So the innovation in this report is just to make that concave, right? And so that's interesting. But obviously the first order advances were the ones in the papers that I mentioned before, which established this weekly relative line and then used the data on national poverty lines to identify it, as it were. So what about the concavity? There are two arguments provided in the report. One of them, which Khalid also took us through, was this sort of Engels law and so on. And I'm not sure that I'm convinced by that justification, because really the whole point of the weekly relative line is that you should move across bundles. It's not that a necessity becomes, that demand for a necessity is concave in income. The point is that there are new necessities as countries grow richer. And so you're kind of moving across those bundles, and whether that's concave or not is anyone's guess. So the second explanation, the second reasoning which the authors provide, is a better one, which is it's a better fit for the poverty lines in the world. And if that's indeed the case, I have no reason to suspect it's not. If that's indeed the case, then that's certainly a factor to be taken into consideration. And I'm sure Dean will have stuff to say on that, as he is one of the authors that worked on the linear line, and we'll have the information on there. The one thing I would say is that there's still some sort of trade-off, perhaps, between the betterment of the fit and the simplicity in communication and analysis of the linear line. Because, a lowest fit of a regression, I mean, where exactly is that? And what are countries going to do to do it? Whereas a simple slope that says your GDP per capita is this is your mean income is this is your poverty line is that. But so I think there's a debate there between communicability and tractability vis-a-vis the better fit. The better fit would be the argument for using this line, if indeed one chose to do it. The second innovation in the report is adding the multidimensionality And in that, I welcome that very much. And in fact, it echoes to some extent what we did at the World Bank when I was still there working with Dean and others. We had a sort of three-part way of measuring global poverty. The core dollar a day line, which is now, I guess, $3 a day, and it's $2.15 in the presentation that we just saw, but that was the core anchor. But then you had also the weekly line, which used that as the flat bit, but then expanded. And then we had the multidimensional, which used that as a dimension, but added other dimensions to it. I think I'm not sure the income is a dimension in the current report. I know that the OFI people don't like that. I think it's very useful to actually have income as an anchoring dimension and then adding other things to it. But I think that's great. Now, there is a lot I could say on the link between poverty and equality, but I feel like I've talked a lot. So maybe I'll leave that, Kunal, for later if I have a chance, and just go back to you.
Yeah, that's absolutely right. Okay, Chico, I'm thinking whether Khalid, we're making your responses to what Chico said, that the linear versus the concave poverty line. Can we take that a bit later when you come in later? Because then we can have that discussion afterwards. So thanks very much, Chico. I can move to Dean. I think we already talked about the poverty inequality platform. Several discussions already. It is one of the main sources for our WIID database. And also, of course, ESCWA's report, as was mentioned by Khalid, along with the Luxembourg income study. So perhaps it would be useful to hear from you on the value of the PIP database, both for research, for how the bank and others are using it to guide programming, and then perhaps your thoughts on how its inequality data compares with other databases, particularly with the WIID, our WIID companion, and of course the Paris School's WIID database. So there are two parts to the question. One is about the value of the PIP database, for us to listen to a little bit about the value as you see it. And then how does the inequality side of PIP compares with the other two databases we already discussed in the earlier today. So over to you, Dean.
Super. Thanks so much, Kunal. Very much appreciate the invitation to join you today. And good afternoon to everyone connected and listening. Let me just first say that I really enjoyed both the presentations by Khalid and Rahul. I find him, I've seen Khalid's paper before, and I think it's a really nice piece of work, and the work by Rahul is fascinating to watch. Let me jump straight in with some discussion on the Poverty and Inequality Platform, or PIP. Maybe the first thing to help people to understand the context is that this is really an update to the initial PovCalNet tool that was developed by Qinghua Zhao and Xiaohua Chen under the guidance of Martin Revalian decades ago. It's a team, the PIP team is one that I've been lucky enough to be part of, that's currently being led by Christoph Lackner under the guidance of Umar Sarajidin and Haishun Fen. And it's really a modernized version of the PovCalNet tool that's placing greater emphasis on ease of access, replicability, and transparency, which are the three attributes that I think really define the increasing value, I guess, in my way of thinking of the PIP tool. So I'll just sort of comment on those three attributes for the value part of the question. Just first by a broad overview, so PIP contains vectors of welfare defined either as consumption or income for 172 countries or economies, covering in some cases more than 35 years. When I say vector, in most cases that's unit record data points where the unit is the household, though in some cases it's bin data. PIP is both the source for the estimates we provide to the United Nations and our role as custodian for several of the SDG indicators on monitoring extreme global poverty and inequality. Perhaps more importantly for the purpose of the discussion today, though, it's a tool that allows users to access data on poverty and inequality with flexibility to really choose their measures, their poverty lines, their sets of countries or regions. Also within PIP, we do try to provide links to reports that are done by our country economists on issues related to poverty and inequality. And we also provide links to all of the published papers that we have that talk about the underpinning measures in PIP. And so I mentioned people tend to think of PIP as being, or the World Bank as having this sort of singular measure of extreme poverty, this $3 a day, but currently set at $3 a day, expressed in 2021 PPP dollars. And I really want to underline that PIP does provide that as the headline statistic, but it allows you to look at poverty rates based on any poverty line of your choosing. So in particular, there was this just a brilliant slide that in Khalid's presentation where it showed differences in global poverty at two different time periods over a continuum of poverty lines. And I think that's an incredibly powerful way to present data because it really sort of reveals this notion of the magnitude of the drop at any particular poverty line that you might choose. And I think that's a really effective way to communicate things. It's easy for people to get that if we take a minute to explain it. And it's also something that PIP is really designed to allow technicians to extract and produce slides like that. It's also going to allow people to extract various measures. So it has sort of hard-coded into it the Foster-Greer-Thorbach measures of poverty. It also has hard-coded into it a new measure that we're using called a prosperity gap measure, which is essentially something akin to a Foster-Greer-Thorbach measure that places greater weight on the poorest people, but it actually places a positive weight on everyone in society. Maybe I'll mention it also reports on, has hard-coded in it, the extreme poverty line of $3 per person per day, but then also two other fixed value lines at higher values of 420 and 830. The reason we report on these three lines, the $3, the 420, and the 830 line, is that they reflect median values of national poverty lines in countries by their income classification. So the $3 is the median poverty line for low-income countries. The $4.20 is the median poverty line for lower middle-income countries, and the 830 is the median line for upper middle-income countries. It also has hard-coded into it the societal poverty line, which is the line that Chico mentioned. And it's also a line that's very similar to the line that Khalid presented in the ESCWA report, which is exactly one of these hybrid poverty lines. So it's a hybrid of an absolute and a relative poverty line. It's set such that it has a flat part such that anytime the lowest value of the societal poverty line is the extreme poverty line of $3 a day. But then as countries get richer, it increases in value at a rate of what has an intercept and then a slope coefficient associated with it. Chico had mentioned this notion of a weekly relative poverty line, and so it's useful to note that then the log specification that in the ESCWA hybrid line is a weekly relative poverty line. To me, what I think is the defining aspect of that weekly poverty line is that it has a non-constant elasticity of changes in the poverty line with respect to changes in the underlying welfare metrics. So in our case, consumption primarily. And you can get that with the curvature, as in the log specification. Frankly, you can also get it, you get it with a flat kink that we have in the societal poverty line, but you're also going to get it with a positive intercept. What's nice about that, about the specification that has the flat bit and then a slope, as in the societal poverty line, is that you have this nice attribute that for the lowest income countries, the societal poverty line is an absolute poverty line. It doesn't change as income increases. At the highest income level, that elasticity starts to converge to 1. So it moves towards a pure relative poverty line. And it's in that in-between period where you move from the flat part of the societal poverty line to the upward sloping part, that elasticity starts shifting from 0 towards 1 in a way that feels pretty natural with how countries tend to think about poverty, where the richest of countries tend to view this more as a relative concept, and the poor countries tend to view it more as an absolute poverty line. And so the underlying point of the line of the ESCWA report and the line of the societal poverty line and all of these weekly relative poverty lines is to be informed or to reflect in some ways average assessments of what countries are telling us it costs to meet basic needs in their countries. And I think, whatever line you choose, I think that concept is really a useful way to start talking about poverty. And so I couldn't agree more with the thrust of the comment of the value of the ESCWA line or of the report that Khalid was presenting. On this issue of Chico brought up this notion of best fit. I'm not going to dive into that too much, but let me just throw out a couple of cautions there that we don't want to talk about best fit in terms of R-squareds of regression models, particularly if we're comparing levels versus logs, because as soon as you shift that dependent variable from levels to logs, it's meaningless to compare R-squareds. There's no, it's just a complete lack of comparability. And so showing us R-squareds isn't going to be a statement that tells us anything about the log being a better fit or not. In our World Bank Economic Review paper, we spend quite a bit of time talking about the various ways of thinking about best fit is in terms of the number of people that are predicted to be poor and looking at sort of a root mean square error in predictions of poverty counts. Is it a root mean square error difference in terms of poverty rates and a few other sort of cuts on this? Is it weighted at the country level by the size of the country or the population, the poverty population? It's a really tough, interesting question to talk about best fit. In our paper that we looked at, we argued that the variant that we used offered a fit that was comparable to a log specification we looked at, and in many of those dimensions, and in some dimensions, the log outperformed it. But we thought the simplicity of the linear specification essentially dominated our decision rule in this case. Anyway, I went into that a bit too long there, but I think let me make just 3 other quick comments on value, and then I'll zip my lip, as it were. On the Poverty and Inequality platform, we've tried to get up all of our documentation on there. So we have an online handbook that tells people or users all of the assumptions underpinning the measures. We've tried to make it accessible to non-technicians through a series of pull-down menus and visualization tools. But at the same time, we also think that its value for researchers is really a critical function that we're serving. So we've spent a lot of time trying to create an underlying API so that researchers can pull down this data, either with Stata wrappers that we've provided or R wrappers with help files associated with that. Most importantly, we've taken the effort to get out very specific version stamps of the data, and we're allowing rollback on those versions to the origins of PIP. And I think that's just critically important for all of these sort of data sources. And it's costly. It's hard to do. It takes a lot of time, but we think it's just critical, and we think that's a really important sort of value added. Last, but not least on the value of the PIP, or the ways that we've tried to expand on this, is that we're trying to build in more metadata into the analysis so that when users pull out this data, they know what they're getting. And in particular, one thing we've invested in is metadata on the comparability or non-comparability of the vectors over time for particular countries. So we try to identify when there are comparability breaks that should help analysts in these types of analysis. Kunal, I've spent way too much time on the value of PIP. Do you want me to comment on the inequality work, or should I be quiet to allow the panel to move on at this point?
I think let's move on, because we'll come back to the inequality discussion. A lot is about poverty so far. And I will give Khalid the chance to respond. Maybe Khalid, your colleague Vladimir, is also online to respond. But let's first now move to Franziska on wealth inequality, because that's what you have been working on mostly, Franziska. And we already heard from Khalid and the ESCWA report that income poverty, while it's fallen differentially across regions, of course, wealth inequality is rising. And at the same time, the report talks about using wealth, identifying wealth, the resource for financing poverty reduction. So again, a couple of questions to you. How critical is it, in your view, to integrate wealth inequality in our analysis? So far, it's not really there. And so what's your perspective on how awareness of persistent increasing wealth inequality should affect our core understanding of global inequality, which so far has mostly been on income and consumption. So what do we miss if we focus mostly on income or consumption? And how do you see the relationship in wealth inequality and poverty? If there is a relationship. That's a more difficult question to answer. So yeah, first, why should we at all worry about wealth inequality? And second of all, what do we actually gain by introducing wealth versus income? What do you?
Yeah, thanks a lot. First of all, I really welcome that the report brings wealth into the analysis, and it does so in a very good way, because it pins down the two key aspects. First of all, the fiscal capacity aspect, and second, the wealth inequality aspect. Because one thing, even though we know way less about wealth inequality than about poverty, than about income inequality, one thing that is clear is that it's different. So it needs special and different attention. So there is a lot of work that has been conducted in the last decade, especially, that really shapes our understanding of how integrating wealth reshapes very fundamentally about how we can think about inequality in living standards in the province. So let me start by approaching this a bit conceptually, because I think the key thing to understand here is how wealth differs from income. So wealth and wealth inequality matters in terms of how it shapes not sort of the consumption possibilities of people, but it is more durable. So it is relevant to opportunities, it's relevant to choices people can make. And at the top of the distribution, it's about the hoarding of advantages and opportunities. So I think wealth in that sense, so it matters to people differentially, not only across countries, but also across the wealth distribution within countries. Because of the bottom, wealth is mainly sort of about a security. So having or not having wealth there kind of allows to take certain decisions to not accept a job, to continue education. In the middle of the distribution, it's a lot about security in the sense of directly being able to use wealth. So that's about real assets, real estate, houses where people can live in. And then at the top of the distribution, where I wouldn't say that wealth inequality is the appropriate term, rather, I think we should speak about wealth concentration. It's about the impact on labor market, the potential impact on democratic processes and institutions. Sort of there, it's not so much about what wealth does to individuals or households, but rather what wealth does to the economy overall. And in summary, we know much less about wealth inequality. So we've been thinking about this for several years now, and we've compiled a database where we include only estimates of wealth inequality that are based on direct observations of wealth. So we don't cover any data points that are imputed. So imputed means sort of non-observed, imputed based on income data, imputed based on other types of data. We can talk about it later in detail, probably. But like using only this proper wealth inequality data, we see that we have information corresponding to about 66% of the global population, a number that drops to 26% once we exclude India and China. Meaning for most countries, for many of low income and low to middle income countries, we actually don't have any wealth data. We know very little. So in that sense, it's really hard to say something specific about the wealth and poverty correlation or the wealth and income inequality correlation. But narrowing the set down to the countries where we have this good data, it's clear that there is no strong correlation to poverty. and also there is no strong correlation with income inequality. So also in that sense, wealth inequality is of a very different nature. And what we see in this data still is, I think, let me stress 3 of our main results. The first one is across the globe, at all periods, at all sort of points in time, wealth inequality always is way, way higher than income inequality. So we're really talking about very different dimensions here. And this is coming from 2 aspects. First, excessive wealth concentration at the top, and second, lack of wealth at the bottom. So the wealth distribution in its shape is very different from the distribution of income. The second thing is, and this is something that has, I would say it's very new, that could not have been said in the absence of our data. For most countries in the world, we have an increase in wealth inequality in the past 20 years. But there is a huge variation in the trends. So wealth inequality has also stabilized in many high-income countries. And finally, in these countries where wealth inequality has increased, this increase has happened at the expense not of the middle of the distribution, but at the expense of the bottom of the distribution. Mm-hmm. And I think China and India are very interesting examples here, because these are the countries where we have observed the biggest reduction in the bottom 50% wealth shares, and it's the country where we have where we observe the largest increase in wealth concentration at the top, both in terms of the wealth share going to the top 10%, the top 1%, and in terms of excessive concentration at the top. So in China and India, sort of the share of wealth held by, let's say, billionaires in GDP has increased from around 5 to 6% in 2000s to about 20% in recent years. So these are really a couple of hundred people who have a wealth that sort of is 20% of GDP. And I think this is really important also in terms of the fiscal aspect again, because wealth concentration is excessive, but it's an inequality dimension that is entirely exempt from redistribution. Because what also is clear is that sort of income taxes designed to be progressive in most of the countries, they really fail at the top of the income distribution and at the top of the wealth distribution. So for all countries where we have this evidence, we have sort of more or less flat or slightly progressive tax rates in household income or household wealth, but then at the very top, within the top 1%, effective tax rates start to decrease. And this is where the mass of the wealth is concentrated. So that's also important to understand here. In terms of the implications for global inequality, I think China and India are very good examples to think about this, because these countries have had huge increases in mean incomes, decreases in poverty, but substantial increases in wealth inequality at the same time. But to paint a picture in terms of global wealth inequality, as for income inequality, we are very far away from that in terms of data requirements and what we can say. And so there is a big gap to be filled here.
Can I just follow up? It's very interesting, actually. I think first is, it seems that the measure of income inequality closest to what you are trying to measure is the WIID Paris School, right? Because they are trying to capture the top 1%, top 10%, where the concentration of wealth is. In a sense, if they had to think of a correlation between all of the 3 measures you've seen so far from the different databases, the one from WIID would be the closest to what you are also measuring.
I would be no, I would. I don't think so, because the Paris School Lab, they have been until recently, they've been publishing measures of wealth inequality for essentially all countries in the world. But these measures are mostly imputed based on data on income inequality and income levels. So this is why in this data set, you then observe a correlation between wealth and income inequality. Because so all the household surveys used for PIP, for example, they don't really capture wealth. So there is no microdata. And as long as you don't observe the variation in wealth across households, you have to resort to something else to compile such a global data set. And these global data sets then usually are developed based on income inequality data, sometimes even just data on mean income levels. And then they impute wealth inequality data based on some things that are observed for a narrow set of countries. So in that sense, I would really be very cautious to speak about this in that regard. Another relevant thing to understand here is that in terms of the imputations at the top. So we've known this for income for a very long time, that the top tail is undercovered in survey data. This, of course, is more problematic for the case of wealth, because the wealth distribution is more extreme at the top, and because it's even harder to capture the wealthiest individuals in survey data in terms of their wealth. So what we see in another project is that when we sort of impute the upper tail, the resulting adjustments in terms of wealth inequality estimates are again way higher than such adjustments in terms of the scales of adjustments that we observe for corrections of income inequality data. So here we really, in some countries, observe doubling of top wealth shares, top 1% wealth shares, which is way bigger than top income adjustments typically are.
Yeah, very interesting. I would love to ask you some more questions, but let's move on into the rest of that. I wanted to bring inequality, and we talked a lot about poverty, but now we're talking about wealth inequality. So now to Rahul, and I'm going to ask then Khalid to respond to the question, the question also from Chico and Dean, and you can bring in feelings in online too. So Rahul, on this question, so basically, we have what is happening now is that different database, different agencies that are using different measuring inequality, right? So the academic literature talks about Gini. This is what we also have in WIID. The Paris School talks about the Palmer ratio. The SEG indicator is the bottom 40%, as you said, the question. So how can we what are the practical differences between these three? These are the measures we see here. And is there any possibility to think of setting on one measure? Or is that too ambitious? And we probably need to live with the different measures of the measuring quality. The second thing is about the consumption of the income data that you showed makes a big difference to inequality measurement, right? And again, we heard from Dean on the question of the PIP, which is about consumption and it comes differently. So how do we again think through this question of if you have to live with a world where you will not get income data for many countries in Sub-Saharan Africa and also South Asia, and we'll get income data for Latin America and other countries. How do we live with this in this world where consumption income data is not available together in many countries where we have most of the world's people?
So on the measures, I think, so we saw in the presentation, there are Gini's, shares, bottom shares and top shares. And these tell a different story. And as we found that top shares might not change or might increase, whereas Gini's might decline. So I don't think we'll ever be in a situation, because all these measures are sensitive to different parts of the distribution. Gini is sensitive to the middle part, shares are sensitive to the parts where top shares to the top and bottom to that part of the distribution. And the sensitivity is also very different. Gini's move slowly, top shares can move rather fast. So I don't think there's one measure which we can do. So that's why what I would recommend is, rather than having one measure in SDGs or for tracking, have multiple measures which capture different things. Maybe Gini plus a share kind of measure, which captures both parts of the distribution. So that is one thing on the measure. On the consumption versus income, it's a fascinating debate, because the consumption versus you're typically in South Asia, most Asian countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, due to informality, capturing income is difficult. And so we have only consumption surveys, whereas Latin America and developed world, we have income surveys. But then comparing inequality in these two different set of is comparing apples to oranges. And so we have to come up with better ways of harmonizing so that our assumptions are clear, because currently WIID harmonization is based on a regression where we try to look at from the country perspective, if the country, like say India, has had an income survey and a consumption survey, so we can match those and say that what might be the consumption inequality. We have a high, if we have more consumption surveys, we can see how we can scale it up to income inequality. That might not be the case in all countries, but at least we take into account the region or the income grouping. But if we have to do cross-country comparisons of inequality, we have to get the welfare concepts right, because these variations, it's also interesting that these variations have an impact which is higher, say, in South Asia versus far lower in, say, China. So we have to compare them. We have to get the concept similarly, and we'll have to live with some kind of harmonizations which will involve some assumptions.
Mm-hmm. That's very useful, actually. I think the thing is that we have what is basically the case, that we will not have consumption and income in the same country for quite some time. Harmonization will be part and parcel of this, but of course, then that needs some assumptions too, right? I want to now actually go back to sort of basically first want to let Khalid respond, perhaps. At this point, do you want to respond?
Yeah, very quickly.
Okay,
I mean, I'll also let Vladimir come in, but I agree with the bulk of the comments by Chico and Dean. I think we're all essentially after the same thing, which is basically how do you best proxy for the way in which cost of basic needs is measured at the national level. Now, countries can measure poverty and poverty lines based on all kinds of thresholds are different. And I think the bank, because it has been involved in a lot of these estimations, so there is some kind of homogeneity in the way that we think. And that's why I said it's a lot of credit to the World Bank, because of the concepts of the food poverty line, the lower poverty line, the upper poverty line. So that gives you some kind of harmony between the way in which countries think about. And that helps a lot because there is that harmonization embedded in the way that we think about poverty. But there are differences. You know, some countries like to think about it in World Bank language more like the upper poverty line measure, which is mainly Latin America. Other countries, especially in the Arab region, would think about it closer to the lower or even below the lower line. And this is where this discussion is. You know, you correct for these outliers, okay? And you're trying to reach a best fit, and we can argue about that, and Vladimir can come in and talk more about that. But also conceptually, we thought that, you know, going back to economic theory helps. You expect that the share of consumption expenditure on basic necessities, even factoring in that there's going to be commodity differences as you grow. You know, you need cell phones, you need other things when you graduate from middle income to upper middle income, etc. But we expect that that share is going to go down. And, you know, we can argue about that later. It's an interesting discussion, and I'm sure we can go on. But I think we are basically in agreement. It is a weekly relative poverty line. It belongs to that class. And definitely we're not the first to put it out. So it's just, it gives us this kind of flexibility to tell the narrative in a way that we think is best proxying the way in which our region and many other regions identify poverty on the ground. But of course, there could be other opinions. And Vladimir, you want to come in and give your 2 cents on this?
Online, yes, Lauren, if you want to come in, I think we can hear you speak.
Yeah.
Just for 1 second, thank you, Dean and Chico, for the comments. I think, like Khalid said, we agree with all of them. in fact, we built on the previous work to propose these poverty lines. And so actually many of the characteristics are follow the characteristics of the preceding lines, like James Foster's hybrid poverty line approach and societal poverty lines. So they have some of the same features, so that again, we put a bottom kind of threshold at 215 or so, above which we get the actual increasing shape. And these ESCWA poverty lines, we call them concave poverty lines, but they are in some way also linear. They're linear between log poverty line and log income. So in terms of communicability, we hope that it's it's still easy to digest for a general audience. And we like the property that at the end there's some a convergence, that these poverty lines are growing, but then they converge to something. So countries that experience a lot of growth or windfall winnings, discovery of oil that gets passed through to citizens, that there is a hope for reducing poverty to zero. If we had a linearly increasing poverty line, we would still expect, the hope of eliminating poverty would maybe go away. And the last thing I will say on this is that, so yes, it was a great reference by Chico that it is in the class of weakly relative poverty lines, only based on some simple statistic of income. We don't have other explanatory variables. So even in settings like future time periods, conflict-affected countries with very little data, we can impute a poverty line. So countries that don't report or don't have national poverty lines, we can still propose an ESCWA poverty line, just like a societal poverty line can do. So this is all from me. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry, Vladimir, I should have introduced you. So this Vladimir Klasny is based in Beirut, also colleague of Khalid in UN-ESCWA. Thanks so much, Vladimir. I want to, because I'm conscious of time, and I just want to make sure we have some time for Q&A, and there's several people here who might want to also ask questions of the panel and also on the audience. So I want to just have two more questions, and that's now looking at the future. So the first question, you can answer both these questions together at the same time. First question is that what kind of measure should we have post 2030? We're already quite clear that we're not so satisfied with current indicators, and there are also reasons for that. So what would the measure that you would propose to have for poverty and or inequality post 2030? Because surely there will be no new indicators coming in. So that's the first question. Of course, there are wealth inequality, other ways they can poverty and so on. That's the first question. And do we think of dashboards really now? We should just move beyond this single indicators to dashboards. So that's another thing to think about. The second question I have is more about the policy and politics of this. So if you have to think of one realistic politically achievable improvement that you could make to the global goals of poverty and inequality, I mean, what would it be? Would it be a new target, a revised indicator, a different marketing framework? So what's possible in the next few years that's politically achievable, realistic? So that's something I also wanted to reflect on. Potentially also, what would be the one or two things that you want to change post 2030? Actually, that's the third question, really. So I'm now going to ask each of the panelists to answer this question in like 2 minutes each or less. And then we're going to have a Q&A. So maybe Chico, you can go first. Okay, thanks, Kunal. I think the main thing I want to say in terms of what needs to happen to the measurement of inequality is actually related to Rahul's very good presentation earlier. And that is an acknowledgement. First of all, it requires an acknowledgement of how much we don't know
about inequality levels. And this is a topic I've been pursuing for a while now. And it's kind of a paradox of progress. We once used this term paradox of progress in a different way, but paradox of progress in this way is the following. Following on the work of Piketty and Emmanuel Saez and others, we learned, perhaps you already knew to some extent, but we learned that surveys have real problems, particularly in capturing incomes at the top and capital incomes. They're conceptually different, but they are related, right? And so there's this underestimate, perhaps. It doesn't need to be an underestimate, as Angus Deaton always points out, but there is in practice an underestimate of incomes at the top in surveys. And so then people moved on to use tax data and other administrative income data, and then even further to try and distribute national accounts income that is not distributed to people to create this dinner, this distribution of national accounts data. As a result of which, you have what François Bourguignon, Nora Lustig, Facundo Alvaredo, and I call inequality bands in a paper that we published with the Latin American and Caribbean Inequality Review recently. And you could see them, these bands, or you could see some of it in Rahul's presentation. There's wide gaps between, say, what you have in the WIDER WIID and in the Paris WIID. And the thing is not, if it would be easy if one of them were wrong and the other one right. But that's not obvious because particularly with the DINA adjustments, there are huge amounts of assumptions that need to be made about distributing things that aren't in effect distributed to households, and different assumptions will lead to different outcomes. And even in the tax adjustments, when you're in Finland and you can use only the tax and administrative data, you're probably on safe ground. But most countries in the world have informal sectors. And so using just the tax data or the administrative data is not enough. You need to combine them. And the combination can be done in various different ways. There's a nice paper by Nora Lustig and co-authors where they show that different ways of making this combination, different ways of splicing together data from the surveys and from tax and administrative data lead to very different outcomes. As a result of which, we are probably at a point where we know that many of the estimates in PIP and in the WIID companion, for example, may in fact be underestimates of inequality, income inequality in many countries, because the surveys on which they're based don't capture as much information about the top as we'd like. But we don't know that the stuff you find on the PSC website is the right answer, because it could be any number of other answers. And so the paradox of progress is that by having learned more about distribution and this data, we find out that we actually know less, certainly about the levels. In terms of trends, this is less a problem, and I think Rahul referred to this as well. But it's still a big issue. And if anything, I mean, I really liked Rahul's presentation. If anything, I thought he was a little more sanguine than I would have been in discussing these differences. I mean, I think they are large. I have a chapter in a book on the London Consensus, which is just being published today, actually, where I plot WIID numbers versus WIID numbers. It's called the Paris versus Helsinki graph. And you've got shares, for a country like Peru, the share of the top 1% for the data when we had it, was 8% in WIID and 28% in WID. Now, what is income inequality like then in Peru? It's high, but how high? We don't know. There are real issues with the data from which we get all this. And until so this requires substantial amount of thinking and investment by people across these organizations represented here today and beyond, particularly for developing countries where the data constellation is more challenging. So that's probably more than 2 minutes, and I have lots of other things to say, but I'll leave it there as that challenge being, something that we really have to recognize. Let me just say, by the way, just in closing, that this is not meant to be a criticism of either the Paris WIID or the Helsinki WIID. In fact, in this paper with Bourguignon, Lustig, and Alvaredo, we use the WIID, the Helsinki WIID, as our base for plotting the bands. But it is something that we must recognize. You know, people, particularly journalists, love one number, right? They love the answer. What is the answer? And the point is, at the moment, we don't know what the answer is for levels of inequality. We have to acknowledge that and deal in terms of bands. That's my plea. Thank you.
Yeah, Chico, I really like the point about having bands for inequality and maybe even poverty. I think that's what we need to think about, what we call economic confidence intervals, more than point estimates. So that's a very nice point I think you made. Dean, do you want to also come in on this issue?
Yeah, and thanks very much, Kunal. And I'm going to pivot just slightly. I happily would offer what I think is a preferred measure, but I'm not going to go that direction, in part because I just want to bring maybe a little bit more a different angle on some of this discussion. So I think there's a really nice recognition that we know that consumption, income, and wealth are all measuring different things, and they're all going to present different sort of profiles of inequality. And so us being aware of those differences is really important in how we interpret these results. I think an angle I've been finding sort of important to bring a little bit more sensitivity to is also an awareness of the intention or the purpose of the underlying survey instrument. So if I think about something like wealth, oftentimes the first question I'll ask someone is, why are you measuring that? Are you just trying to inform? Are you trying to get mean wealth in the country? Are you trying to inform national income accounting, or are you trying to do something where you just want an aggregate measure? Or do you want to know the distribution of wealth? Because you'll design your survey instrument completely differently depending on your answer to that question. And so we might look at a database full of income measures and think they're all designed to be net disposable income, for instance. But if the underlying function of these surveys is to primarily inform national income accounting, that measure of income will look very different than if it's a measure that's designed to look at well-being in the income space. And what I'm getting at here is just, so I've at different points in time, I've read these handbooks on methodology for collecting national income accounting, and they make this very sort of salient point that if you're trying to get mean wealth, you don't want to spend a lot of time with relatively poor people asking details, because that's time wasted on trying to get higher wealth individuals to respond to your questions. And so if you think about something like wealth, the bottom 50%, there's going to be massive differentiation in terms of overall wealth being, but it's going to be incredibly hard to measure, because it's going to be things like trying to capture the health of the livestock that they happen to own. And that's just timely and extremely challenging. Whereas if you're trying to get a mean measure of wealth, you're going to spend most of your time trying to find the top tail of this distribution and trying to get sort of measures of financial resources, which are challenging to get, but at least defined in comparable units. And so this notion of sort of thinking about things just as consumption, income, and wealth differences is correct, but it's nuanced in sort of understanding what's the underlying data generation process that has produced those estimates is also an important sort of distinction in the comparability of these measures over space. I think there's also some work that I'm currently doing too, is that we're all sort of aware that income or consumption and wealth, depending on how we measure this, is either at the individual level or at the household level in many cases, if it's consumption or income. But if it's at the individual level, there's not a lot of attentiveness to the household composition that individual resides in. And thinking about the allocation of income or the allocation of wealth or the allocation of consumption within a household is something that we largely have almost no data on. There are a few countries where we have a little bit of data on this, but that's a massive element of inequality, particularly if you're trying to answer questions about gender differences in inequality or child-adult differences in inequality. We largely, and this goes to Chico's point about just sort of acknowledging our lack of understanding of inequality. I think that point just really resonates with, for anything happening in terms of within household inequality differences, most of our data sources aren't going to be terribly helpful on that, because we don't understand sort of sharing rules. So I'll just, yeah, I'm not quite sure how to summarize that answer, but I just kind of wanted to highlight that it's important to talk about differences in consumption, income, and wealth, but it's also important to recognize that there are many other sort of measurement challenges in terms of understanding profiles of inequality and profiles of poverty, and bringing a sensitivity to those measurement issues, I think, is also really challenging and important. All right, over and out. Thank you.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point that you made, that we don't really have enough knowledge or even databases that look at within household inequality, different dimensions actually. And that's something that we should think about moving forward, post 2030 possibly. Franziska, over to you.
I can only second and stress what has been said already. So I think data transparency really is important and has received too little attention in the past. So we see also similar to what Chico has been working on for the case of income inequality, we see such a big variation in estimated levels of wealth inequality for a given country, depending on research methods, depending on the unit of analysis. And this is in the case of wealth, I think it's also important in terms of the levels. So even though in most cases the trends are very similar, we have a big variation in the levels. And in my understanding, it is a different society, as in cases where the top 1% are estimated to hold like 18 or 20% of the wealth, as compared to 40 or even higher shares when we do certain adjustments that make sense for the case of wealth. Because all the wealth surveys that we are using, none of them really, and this is now relevant to what Dean has said, none of them really has been designed to capture the top. Mm-hmm. Most of these surveys have a background or originate in central banking to understand sort of average household vulnerability to macro shocks and so on. So they were not designed to measure the top. And this is why it's so important to bring that in from other sources. In terms of your question, so I think such a dashboard approach would be really a good way forward. And let me stick, because this is what I best understand, to the case of wealth. So as I've tried to explain, wealth inequality, I think, matters differently across the distribution, where I see a need for at least 3 different indicators. One, centering at the top. And this is relatively easy to obtain from rich lists and billionaire data and so on and so forth. And this is also where a lot of the policies around wealth taxation now are sort of speaking to. The other one is probably something related to the complete lack of assets. So where the idea probably is to identify people that are both poor or have a lack of income and consumption possibilities and a lack of assets, versus people that are having some assets versus no strings. And these are 2 different groups of people. And I think in the middle, it's a lot about security or insecurity, sort of the share of people that in the absence of public programs or publicly provided goods and services has the possibility to draw on their private wealth. And so in that sense, to me, this dashboard approach for the case of wealth is very compelling, because the specific problems related to lack of wealth or wealth concentration, they are different across the distribution, and there is not one indicator able to capture this.
Absolutely. Well, thank you. I think that's a very important point. And as you said, asset poor versus very, very asset rich. There are 2 very different kinds of issues here. I was thinking that, Khalid and Rahul, if you don't mind, let's take questions from the audience, and then you can also respond.
Sure.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So first, let's see if there are any questions online.
Okay, there are.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Okay, so I have several questions from the online audience. I'm just going to start with 3 of them for Khalid, and then I can answer other ones after we do in person.
Yeah,
that's okay. So the first 2 questions are actually related to what Khalid mentioned in his report about the rising rate of poverty among Arab countries, and some confusion from the audience. So some clarification needed. One question is the decline Or is the stagnation and the decline of poverty in the Arab world correlated with the Arab Spring, which caused unstable political systems? Please do correct me if I'm wrong in my assessment from Navnet Bot. The second question is, good day. For the Arab world, can tackling multidimensional poverty be achieved in authoritarian countries? That's from Edo Andreas. And then the other question I have for Khalid is related to the recommendation of applying progressive fiscal policy. And the question is, how can you concretely do this, which is applying progressive fiscal policy, under a dominating neoliberal economy? And similarly, how do we fight tax evasion under the dominant neoliberal economic thinking we have in most countries today? From Naji Gawa.
Yeah, very challenging questions. But let's just wait on this. We want to get a few questions from the audience, from the in-person audience. So now it's your turn, those of you here, to ask questions to not only to Khalid, Rahul, but the panel itself. So questions? Yep, please go ahead.
Thank you. I'm Antti Raukola from the Bank of Finland. My question is maybe more to Khalid, but I was thinking that could we maybe think of measuring poverty or income through productivity? So let's say in practice, typically when a nation is wealthier or has more income, it's more productive. So like, for instance, if we know that in the US, for example, we need one farmer to produce enough food for like 125 people, whereas that's a lot less in sub-Saharan Africa. So could we do some measurements of poverty through productivity? Thank you.
Very good, thank you. Any more questions in the in-person audience here? Yeah, go ahead. Please, can you just introduce yourself?
Yes, my name is Karin Taipale. I'm actually an urban researcher, but also more or less active in politics. And as a complete amateur in statistics, I look at these issues from a political and of course from sustainability perspectives. I always remember how Klaus Töpfer, who in those days was head of UNEP, highlighted how difficult it is to get data about pollution from certain countries. And now this reflecting to your problems in a world of increasing number of tax havens and autocracies, data is always dangerous. So I listening to you, I have this feeling that it's going to be more and more difficult to get data on which to really develop policies globally. Thank you.
Thank you. Any other questions? No? Okay. Khalid, you had quite a bunch of questions.
Yes, thank you. On the issue of rising poverty in Arab countries after the Arab Spring, that is correct. And a lot of the rise in poverty is because of conflicts affected countries having significant rise in the headcount ratios, and specifically Yemen, Syria, and other countries. But those two countries, because of their demographic weight, have produced that. But also bigger countries. Remember, the Arab Spring had also produced a regional spillover effect that reduced the growth rates in many countries, including Jordan, Egypt. And in Egypt in particular, you had a lot of instability as well during the period from 2010 to 2019 at least. So that also had an impact. So yes, the Arab Spring and the period after 2010 is, we can see rising poverty, mainly because of the conflict-affected country effect. Multidimensional poverty can it be reduced in authoritarian countries? Well, you'd first have to give a strict definition of what you mean by authoritarianism. But if you just take your regular measures of democratic governance, World Bank or other varieties of democracy database, and you make a correlation between poverty, income, and some kind of measure of democratic governance. You don't really see that strong of a correlation worldwide. You do see it with government effectiveness, but not with democratic governance. Does it mean that autocracies can reduce poverty faster? Not necessarily. It's just every country has its own unique specificities. Look at China, for example. That's a very good example, but there are other counter examples as well. Progressive fiscal, how would you actually implement in a new liberal economy? I mean, again, regardless of these debates on what is a new liberal economy, what is not, all of that, if you don't have the information, if you don't have the spectrum of wealth distribution, and if you don't have the information on top incomes and top wealth, which ties in with our earlier discussion, you will not be able to make informed decisions. So we've repeatedly called for making it compulsory, as the case in Europe, to report on wealth and income. Then a lot of these debates are going to be informed. So you want to make good progressive policy decisions, fine, but you need to have that infrastructure. And I think here's where the UN and the World Bank can play a big role. Continuously push for mandatory, compulsory wealth and income reports. Mm-hmm. Now, productivity is not necessarily, by the way, tied with poverty reduction or lower poverty. So, I mean, look at frontier economies in our region. You have very low total factor productivities and at this actually declining at the same time of expansive wealth. So it's not always the case that your traditional notion of productivity is going to correlate with poverty reduction. That did happen in the transformations in East Asia and other countries, but you need to have a structural transformation happening with that. You need to have a process that leads to decent work and increase in total factor productivity. That's your traditional story. It doesn't happen like this in all countries, certainly not in frontier or rich countries. So I'll think I'll stop here.
Thanks, Khalid. Anyone else from the panel to chip in? And though we have a couple more questions, the online audience too. Is that right?
Yeah, shall I ask some more questions?
Yeah, if you let's take the questions and then we can have a closing session.
Okay, so I'll ask a couple of them, and I think anyone can answer these questions. So if you want, please volunteer. The first one is from Angela Juliet in Uganda. She says, I feel the applicability of the SDGs cannot have universal application in the global North economies and the global South for developing economies. Are there strategies in the projected future period, 2025 to 2040, to help the global South countries rise up from poverty and inequality to a reasonable level? Very broad question. A second question, moving back to the technical debate from Trang Pham in Vietnam. Regarding inequality measures, which indicators are the most important or reflective of inequality? Should we use Gini-Palmer ratios or the share of the 80 over the share of the 20th, bottom 80, top 20? And he asks which indicators for comparing countries and which indicators to take into account policy recommendations for reducing inequality.
Okay, all right. So those are the two online questions that are remaining. So let's now get some responses from the panel. I think the last question actually is very relevant for the discussion here. So let's try to get a quick response from whoever wants to speak first. So that's Chico and Dean online, and then Rahul, Franziska, and Khalid here. So anyone, particularly the last question, and we can go back to the earlier question after when we look at the last question. Exactly, are there differences? Well, I think you already heard that it depends on what you're already measuring, Rahul, on the inequality. But the question here is about, for policymakers, is there a specific measure that they should focus on versus the academic debate, which can go on and on about distribution issues, so on. For a policymaker, you have to tell the policy there is one measure they need to focus on. Which one would it be? Chico, do you want to go on first on this?
Sure. I'm going to say something about the measures and then something about the data question that the lady in the room there asked as well. So, I mean, I think Rahul kind of said this in his presentation, but inequality measures, you know, they differ from one another, not because they're right or wrong, but because they're sensitive to different parts of the distribution, right? I mean, some of them have other problems, but amongst a set of good inequality measures, like the Gini coefficient, or even income shares, which have their problems, or the mean log deviation or the tile index, they all focus on different parts of the distribution. So I think the key thing that should guide for a policymaker's decision is, what are they most concerned with? And let me simplify, because you could become very technical about this, but just simplify. Suppose you are either concerned primarily about the effect of inequality on poverty in the bottom of the distribution, or you are concerned about the very extreme concentration at the top, which may lead to elite capture and so on and so forth. Well, then in the former case, I would use a measure like, say, the mean logarithm deviation, which is often used. And if the communication issues around that are complex and you want something more basic, use the Gini. I actually once wrote a blog called In Defense of the Gini Coefficient. A lot of important economists in the profession criticize the Gini coefficient for everything. The Gini coefficient is actually a pretty good measure. It's more sensitive to the middle. But if you are interested in the broad mass of the distribution rather than the very top, the Gini is preferable to top income shares, okay? Because it captures what's going on across the entire distribution. So there you have a choice. You know, there are many others, but you could have the mean log deviation, which is really sensitive to the poor, or the Gini coefficient, which is sensitive to the middle. If instead you're particularly worried about the fact that there is a sort of oligarchy that's controlling everything, and you're really worried about distribution at the very top, then I think the top shares that Piketty and others have been using, top 1%, top 0.5%, top 1/10%, are reasonable measures. They have other problems, but they're reasonable for that purpose of identifying concentration at the very top. And then if I have just 1 minute for the data question, you know, there was this question about data availability given the rise of autocracies. And I want to say to that there's actually two countervailing forces. One is actually data over the last 20 years has become much more abundant. 20 years ago, it was very hard to get access to tax data in most countries in the world. And in fact, driven in part by academic research, many ministers of finance and tax authorities across the world have made that data available. There's also increasing availability of big data from the private sector, from which we can infer lots of things about distribution, from credit card data, from all kinds of big data out there. And that said, so that I think is the good news. But the worry that was expressed about autocracies is not baseless. And to that, let me just point to the example of India, which is not the most autocratic country out there, but does have a government that was very worried about the measurement of poverty. And as a result, India held a certain part of the household survey data for whatever year it was. I don't remember anymore. Either Rahul or Dean will know for sure. But they held that to that data and did not make it public for many years, which meant that various people had to keep estimating what poverty might be in India from all kinds of other sources, right? So there is a threat. And if you see Donald Trump firing the heads of statistical agencies that don't give him the answer he wants, you know, we may laugh and think it's funny right now, but it could have a real repercussion. It could have a real repercussion. So whilst there is, I think, a very nice trend of increasing availability of data and of computing power to process that data, which has powered some of the progress we've made in the last 20 years. On the other hand, there really is a threat about transparency, and we should be on our guard and ask for that transparency whenever we interact with these governments. Thank you.
Thanks, Chico. Dean?
So Yeah, it's interesting. It's probably not so surprising that Chico and I are drawn to the same types of responses and questions, but I too wanted to respond to that the last comment in the first round about concern about the lack of data availability in this new era, to just say that I do think that's a very valid concern, and just completely agree with Chico's sort of summary of this, that look, we've had this amazing kind of history of advances in access to data. But I do think we are seeing some backsliding in certain places, and I think we need to be very attentive to that. About 3 years ago, I worked on a World Development Report, Data for Better Lives, and we emphasized this notion of an attribute of data of trust, and sort of one element of the discussion. And I walked away from that report thinking we need to spend much more time focused on trying to enhance trust in data and reliability in data. I think part of an ability of political powers to move away from empirically informed decision making is if they can create distrust in the data sources that are out there. And I think it's really incumbent on those of us who use data and who help to collect data to be as transparent as possible and to get all of the details out there about the data in ways that help people to understand how these data can be used and how they probably should not be used. I'll use that maybe as a segue into your question about which measures. I'm gonna stay fairly agnostic as to that answer. I think many of these measures are all very useful and just have different attributes. What I think is really something that we need to pay more attention to is which data are we using to answer these questions of inequality. And I'll go back to that sort of standard comment that we need to think much harder about the coverage of these data sources. So we need to pay much more attention to recording metadata with these things so that we know non-response rates at the tails of these distributions. And we need to better understand when we're using data, what imputations have been done on these data. Are they reasonable imputations? Are they documented? Are they transparent? Are they accessible to understand how these have been made? And fundamentally, do the concepts that are underpinning these measures make sense? If it's a wealth measure, are we capturing the way people in the bottom 50% store their wealth, or are we just focusing on wealth in a dimension that doesn't make sense for the vast majority of people? Same with income, same with consumption. So just to sort of try to bring highlight to, as important as the measures are, I would argue an equal amount of attention to the quality and the attributes of the data sources is just as important. Thank you.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Jean. Franziska, if I give Rahul.
I just wanted to add one more aspect as regarding the relationship between inequality measures and policies, because in addition to the need for different measures or a measure targeted to the question, I think it cannot be stressed more that you should never expect inequality measures to change a lot from one year to the other. So it's really important to consider longer term trends, because we know very clear that changes from one year to the next can result from changes in measurements, from changes in the survey instrument. And if you have if you typically observe big jumps, it tends to be more indicative of sort of a change in the underlying methodology than a real change in the distribution, if such jumps sort of happen from one year to the next. So for policy assessments, I think it's really important to not compare year by year, but to look at longer term trends, or probably even averages over windows, years.
Absolutely. Rahul, do you want to?
Yeah, on the indicators question, I agree with Chico that indicator might be based on the purpose, which it's like Gini or mean log deviation, if you want to look at what is happening in the middle or lower part of the distribution. And shares also, and on Chico's earlier comment that whether the WIID or the Paris WIID, I also don't think of it as one is correct or wrong. In terms of they are giving different answers and the assumptions are different, it's puzzling actually for the public to understand, because you can say this, but we need to come to somewhere give ranges or bands so that we can talk about it a little better and document these things as easily as possible. And finally, on the data aspect, so it's true that sort of data is a big resource now, and governments particularly use it based on whether they like the data which is going to come out or not at certain points. But it's also important to very clearly communicate the data, because data can be used, the same data can be used to say different narratives, because you can obviously slice it, and which has happened a lot in India in particular, which I've observed. But as academics, we need to learn to communicate a little better so that it's not a terminology, but the more precisely, more clearly we communicate, the better, at least in the data aspects.
That's good.
Yeah, I think basically there's a real danger about data availability going forward, especially with funding cuts, EHS, for example. So we are going to have, I think, some serious, we're going to be seriously handicapped going forward. And as Dean and Chico said, this is a real concern. But also on your question on the indicators, inequality is just inherently a more difficult we have the report Rethinking Inequality in the Arab countries, and we were trying to put together a story between inequalities of outcomes and opportunities, and even in outcomes, different outcomes over time. And it was even for one indicator like income. I mean, this whole discussion has been about one indicator. So it is a very difficult subject, but it's a very important one. And the outcome of that depends on many things, but it also influences the poverty narrative. I mean, think about sub-Saharan Africa, where a lot of the evidence suggests that this is the area where it's most, the information is most biased, because we don't know what's happening at the top tail of the distribution. Well, if the Gini increases significantly, and then all of the narrative that I presented was going to be even worse, because you're going to have a much higher Gini. Of course, the average income might rise, but the overwhelming impact will be to increase poverty, because the Gini is going to be rising tremendously. So I think as was said earlier, it really depends on the questions, and really depends on why we want this particular indicator. That's why global consultations on the SDGs or beyond the SDGs are important. Countries have to decide what is important to them, which part of the distribution is worthy to look at. And I agree, the Gini seems to be a reasonable option for inequality. Our answer on poverty was clear, that don't focus on one group of the poor. Doesn't mean that we have provided the correct answer, but whatever answer you give, just make sure that you're covering varieties of deprivation, of degrees of deprivation. One last comment on the target, because you did ask about that. One thing I think we can do differently is, rather than set these targets somewhere in New York or at the headquarters level, let the countries decide on what works for them. Let them set the targets, and that becomes part of the consultation. Once you've decided on the metric, let them decide on what works for them, and then aggregate, so that the global target becomes an outcome of the average decisions of all countries. We haven't done that before. I think it's time to give it a shot.
Well, that's a very nice way to think about concluding remarks, Khalid. I just want to say, actually, I wanted to thank you first, because Khalid, I should give a bit of background. Khalid came to us, and we were privileged that we could launch the UN-ESCWA report today in UNU-WIDER. I feel very proud of this, because in WIDER, we always take data and measurement and concepts very seriously. And the fact that, Khalid, you came to us to launch a report is something that I think we very much value. And what I also find very, very nice about the debate today is that there was such a rich discussion on concepts, measures, data, questions around exactly, as Francis pointed out, about political issues that come with wealth inequality, all the different things that we discussed today. Shows how important this debate was, that Khalid, you started initiated by the report. So hopefully this is just the start of this conversation, looking through the future. And I think the point really is that whatever we think about the measures and concepts, we have to also be aware that we have to protect our data in the sense that data is under threat for political reasons, and also what happened recently with the DHS in the US. So it's very important for all of us who work in this space to make sure we do our best to try and protect the data sets we value, and also to try to tell wherever it is, bilaterals, multilaterals, national governments, that they need to also put in their effort in trying to make sure data sets they also have also are up to date. We have a problem in many countries where data sets are far behind what we need, as was discussed. In fact, I think you mentioned, and Rahul also mentioned that. So we need to try and do something about this. So just to sort of end by saying that not only did we have this discussion, we're going to produce 2 background notes. They're going to come out next week. One on poverty by Andy Sumner, which summarizes the debates we already had and looks at the different measures on global poverty, and one by Rahul, which will all be on global inequality. So for those who want to kind of engage with this discussion, this debate, hopefully next week you're going to see the background notes plus these discussions also on going to be on YouTube very soon. So let's carry the conversation on going forward. And thanks to all the panelists, and thanks to the audience both here in person and also online. Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks, Chico and Jane. Thank you for joining us at different times of the day.
Absolutely. Thanks for the invitation.
Thanks.